Hello and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Adi Achint, proud to present to you a latest series of crisp and clear strategic discussions called the General's Talk, featuring Lieutenant General Ravi Shankar and Lieutenant General Satish Dua. Lieutenant General Ravi Shankar, PVSM, AVSM, VSM, a retired Director General of the Artillery, now a professor in the Aerospace Department of the IIT Chennai. He is also an author of a strategic blog called thegunnershot.com. Lieutenant General Satish Dua, PVSM, UYSM, SM, VSM, served as the Chief of the Integrated Defence Staff to the Chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee. Today, he is a strategic thinker as well as an author of a book called The India's Brave Hearts. Subscribe to Dev Talks and hear what the generals have to say. Welcome to the General's Talk. Post our discussion last week, as promised, we are back to discuss the challenges of the process of theaterization of the Indian Armed Forces. In the last discussion, we gave you a brief on what the concept is all about and how do we look at it going forward in the short-term future. We also discussed the position of the CDS, his responsibilities, and what would the advantages be of having the theaterization of the Indian Armed Forces. After the news of the recent meeting on the subject and its outcomes, a lot of veterans, experts, and others have articulated their concerns, their suggestions on these moves. I'd like to mention here that the process of theaterization of the US forces took more than a decade, and they still are making changes to it all the time. In the same way, the United Kingdom took close to a decade to do the same activity. Some give an example of the Chinese. I'd like to reserve my comments for that, as systems are different in that army, and for us to sit here and gauge as to what are the challenges that they face on the command level is very difficult. We have picked a few of the topics in discussion and would request the generals to give their views on the same. Thank you, sir, for joining me today.
Well, thanks. It's always a pleasure to be back with all of you and for this special edition of the General's Talk.
So I'd like to open with the first question. Now, there has been a committee which is formed with the vice chiefs of the three services, the chief of integrated defense staff. Apart from that, some other ministries, key ministries that has been mentioned, post the last meeting to iron out certain issues. The CDS in his statement is very, very confident of going forward with this activity. May I request your comments? General Satish, would you like to start, please, sir?
The Vice Chiefs Committee is not a new structure. Vice Chiefs Committee is a standing committee under the chairmanship of the CISC, the Chief of Integrated Defense Staff, and it comprises of all the three vice chiefs. And I've headed it for 2 years. It routinely takes up issues and resolves the issue. Now, this works under the under the Chief of Staff Committee, which comprises of the chiefs and the CDS now. From time to time, depending on the issue or agenda being discussed, you call in experts. And so, for this particular issue of integration process, the committee has been beefed up by domain experts. Having traveled certain distance in terms of consultations, when you have to formalize a structure, all the integrated structures that have to be formalized, before formalizing it, then you need participation from outside the ministry as well, because for a cabinet note to be drafted, which is in process right now, which must be in process right now, for a cabinet note to be drafted, then you require interministerial consultations. So the key ministries are consulted. Ministries that are involved, for example, the foreign ministry, the finance ministry. If there is a legal requirement, then it also goes to the law ministry. So when all these consultations have to take place to design the architecture of the new structures, in this case we're talking about the integrated commands. So the Vice Chiefs Committee has been mandated to sort out some contentious issues, and also for wider consultations of the issues that have already been sort of discussed or decided, or sometimes decided with some reservations on part of some stakeholders, and those have to be then set in for wider consultations with all the other stakeholders that I mentioned. So that is essentially what is happening in terms of the Vice Chiefs Committee. One has been reading a lot of it in the press, but I would just want to say that it is a natural, it is a part of the process and it is the way it should be.
If I may just add on, you know,
Yeah.
yeah, what General Dua said is absolutely right. And especially in the context that theaterization is a major change. It's going to be a monumental change for the nation. So it's only logical that all the stakeholders in this process get integrated at this stage, rather than they sticking out as sore thumbs later. So and this process of the vice, it's best left to the vice chiefs to resolve the issues. And of course, we all know that there are a few issues which have come up, which need a little more ironing and clarity, and maybe a little more discussion, not at the level of the chiefs and the CDS always. Certain things can be discussed at a lower level and resolved better. And I'm sure we'll discuss these issues. We
We'll
could take it
discuss
up
these
one by
issues.
one. Yeah, yeah,
Interesting. So I
yeah.
think both of you are trying to say that it is being resolved by the actual executors that are going to be there on the ground, and that is something which is very logical to somebody who's standing outside and seeing this whole process. So the key points that were discussed in the meeting in the South Block, in the early part of the month of June, was the executing authority for the three service commands, the three integrated theatre commands, the geographies they will control, and the command and control structure that they will have. There will obviously be a lot of changes, and things will not be the same as what we were, operating till now. Ravi Shankar, may I request you to kind of share your opinion on this particular thing, sir?
Yeah, what we'll do is I'll give a model which is being followed in USA, and I'll leave it to General Satish Dua to put across his views as to how things are being planned in India, and then we'll see how we should go about it and what are the options available. If you look at the Goldwater Nichols Act and the structure which came out, what is the command and control system in USA? I'm not talking about the Chinese model because it's not applicable to us at all. There, it's the president who is the CNC. Under him is they call the foreign secretary of the state, defense secretary. The defense secretary is virtually the or equivalent of the RM. He has a staff, a joint staff, and he's the one who is in direct command and control of the theaters. So the theater commanders report to him. I mean, we also have to remember in the case of America, the theaters are global. There's an Africa command and PACOM and the European command that way. Right. So the theater commanders report to the defense secretary, and the defense secretary is responsible to the president. And the chiefs of respective services, they have four services: Army, Navy, Air Force, and the Marine Corps. They prepare the services and for the theater commands. They're a service provider virtually to the theater commands, but all of them are part of the joint chief of staff committee, and they have a joint chief of staff who heads all the theaters. Who, I won't say heads all the theaters. He is the one who advises the defense secretary on how to handle various things, and he's got a joint staff, right? So their system is that laid out that way. And what is more important is it is laid out by law. It is not an arrangement. It is not a bill. It is enacted by the Senate. It's an act of the Parliament, if I put it so. So everyone's duties are laid down, right? And it is very formalized and codified. But having said that, despite that codification and enactment and everything, it still took them a long time to come to it, and they had to change the structures as time went by. Uh, Obviously, we'll not have the same thing because our system is vastly different. We don't have a presidential form of a government, right? We have a parliamentary system. So how it is, Satish, I think you're better qualified to do it because you were in the thick of it.
Yeah, thanks, sir. Uh, like you said, our system cannot follow their lines of command exactly, and our structure should be based on our needs, not theirs. Like we don't have world divided into six theaters, and then we are looking only at our model. And contrary to what you said, Achin, and actually speaking, only in terms of structures, uh, Chinese model is quite akin to ours, or our because they are also based on their borders. Their reorganization is based like that. I am not trying to say that we copy their structures, but we are not in an expeditionary mode like the US or the UK forces are structured. Having said that, once now that we are in the process of integrating our structures, eventually we will also have the integrated commanders, whether we call them integrated theater commands or whatever other name that might come up. But those integrated commanders, for the moment, we'll call them theater command because it's a word that is stuck. So these theater commanders will be responsible for a particular area. Let us say if it is northern area, and a northern area is responsible for, by and large, is responsible for China. The southern or the maritime or the peninsular, whatever name comes up later, is responsible for the south and for the seas. Then not only will they have these the three forces, we have three services. Not only will they have the appropriate components of the three services, even the other inputs, whether it is diplomatic linkage, whether it is intelligence, all of that, and so many other verticals when you talk of cyberspace and so many other factors that will come in, aspects that come in, all will then merge and be available at a theater level, at that integrated command level. When such inputs are available, then the theater commander, the integrated structure commander, will be responsible and accountable for that particular adversary, that particular part of the border, to the leadership. The leadership in our case is the Raksha Mantri, the National Security Council, or the Prime Minister. So eh, he is the go-to man. His accountability, the accountability also lies with him, and to carry out his or to prosecute his operations, all resources will be placed at his command. So, what is different? The difference is that earlier, whatever service or component or other input that was required, everything then flowed to Delhi. That means every headquarter was in Delhi, and then from here things were then distributed and went back. So the coordination was happening in Delhi, whether it was this terrain or that border or this adversary or the seas. Everything was then taking place from centrally from Delhi. So with a country like ours, and seeing that today's the OODA loop has to be shortened, integration has taken place in most militaries in the world, and hence we are going to enhance our combat potential by doing this. So the last thing I want to say in terms of lines of command will be that once the integrated structures are in place, then the integrated commander will be responsible, accountable for his particular area. He and the service chiefs, like General Shankar said, happens in other countries, the service chiefs eventually will then be responsible for raise, train, sustain the functions of their particular service. But at the high table, we discussed in the last discussion as well, at the high table will be commanded by, which will be chaired by the CDS, will be the three chiefs, the theater commanders. They will form the high table that not only give advice, that also, if there is any reallocation of forces required temporarily for a particular operation or a particular period, all those big decisions will then be taken by the advice of this high table to the leadership.
Yeah, what people have to understand is Today, the structure is that the Chief of Staff Committee is not an executionary committee, it is an advisory committee. And the execution is today with the respective chiefs. This will shift, and this shift, the crux of theaterization and the smoothness which we go lies in the shift which is going to take place.
True. Yeah.
The shift from the chiefs having the executionary responsibility, shifting from the theatre commanders to the Chief of Staff Committee, right? And then under the CDS, the execution will take place. Though today it is mandated that the Chief of Defence Staff does not have a executionary role. He is only a staff and an advisory role. But eventually, when the whole thing thinks, the CDS will have to have some kind of a executionary role, okay, operational role. And that will also be interim. Ultimately, the operational role, as like General Dua said, will be between the RM and the theatre commander. That's the final. But we'll have to go through this process. You can't straight away jump from, because the RM also doesn't have the staff to do it. You see, if you see the American model, the defense secretary has a staff, a joint staff. The joint staffing, it is laid down again in the Goldwater-Nichols Act. What will be the staff of the defense secretary? What will be the staff of the joint chief of staff and each service staff and the theatre? So we need to go slowly, right? Morph one to the other. And finally, it will have to be the political control from the, in our case, from the PM to the RM, down to the theatre commanders, with the CDS and everyone being in the advisory role. But I don't visualize that happening in a hurry, nor should it, because our politics also are not in tuned to this kind of a thinking. As of now.
Achin mentioned that it took 10 years in the UK, long in the US. Let me tell you, in Australia, he's called the CDF, the Chief of Defence Forces.
Yes.
In Australia, it actually took 14 years for the mandate to really come and evolve.
Yes.
So and also we must remember, like I think spoke last time, that we cannot afford to be off balance. We are not an island country. We have two active borders. We have nuclear countries as adversaries. So we also have to be very careful that we don't create turbulence that makes us off balance as far as defense preparedness is concerned.
See, we also, I mean, there's a daily talk that China is amassing troops and, it's hardening its position on the LAC. We have a live situation and a nebulous situation developing in Pakistan with Afghanistan going this thing. So you, at no stage can we be imbalanced. If I would put it, I think we should be more careful. We should err on being slower, right? Continue with the present structure and slowly morph into the new structure. It is better to err on being slower than do things in haste and get into a problem. Yeah,
I think that's a very interesting perspective both of you have put across. That one mustn't rush into this entire thing, and that is what I think most of the experts and most of the people that are writing about this today are fearing, that we will just switch over and there's going to be big problems and stuff like that. But
yeah, I have only one thing to add to this.
I think
fools rush in where angels fear to tread. That should be the motto for this entire process.
What I was going to say is that I think the press and some of us who know little and want to talk more about than we know tend to make very exaggerated analysis. I think the task that the process that is taking place at its own speed, and rightly so. And it will get even slower because of things that will crop up. What is being made much of is in the media, or someone writing about it, and perhaps people lobbying with their point of view or the other. Otherwise, things are going on, I think, smoothly and slowly.
Agreed. I think that's a very wise way of putting it across. So because when a layman reads all this stuff, he really thinks that what's happening, and it's a very, very difficult scenario. And one of the biggest contentions, which is obviously in this whole thing, is I wouldn't call it the reservation, but I would call it the concerns of the Indian Air Force with regards its limited availability of platforms, limited squadron numbers, and of course, one also is fearing the factor that by reserving the air power into a particular theater command, one will reduce the mobility factor of the Air Force as well as the interoperability of various different platforms for different roles. This has also been voiced out by many, sir. I'd like you to share your opinion on this, and how do you see this particular thing going forward? Ravi Shankar, sir?
No, yeah. The first thing is, uh, we all know that the Air Force is not as per sanction strength. Okay, you can't keep waiting for the sanction strength to come up and then say, then only I can theaterize. So you have to theaterize as is various condition first. The second thing is, okay, we all know as a nation that we don't have enough aircraft. But air power is not only about aircraft, it is also about missiles and rockets, for which we have adequate technology and which army has. So why don't we maximize that and plug the gap which is appearing because of what lack of our air force, and then meld the two and then look forward. So that is one way of looking at it. So that will overcome this fear of lack of numbers, and that you can't theaterize. The second thing is, I'll explain it to you in a slightly different way. You see, I've commanded an artillery division. Now, an artillery division has two gun brigades and composite brigade of long range vectors. Now, the artillery division is held under a corps. It's under orbit of a strike corps, but it is actually a theater reserve. Okay, it gets deployed for theater tasks. There are two gun brigades and a missile brigade. Now, these elements are initially given to the pivot corps or the holding corps for their operations. And as the battle progresses, they are either allotted or not, but they are there. It's a complex system. It's something like what we're talking of theaterization, like Air Force being in a theater or not there, it can't be used, can be delegated. So it's a flexible thing with a lot of cooperation. Then when the offensive is to start and the strike corps gets into action, all these, the artillery switches to the strike corps. Even when it switches to the strike corps, certain resources are allocated to the strike corps for their operations, but certain long range systems are not given to them. The theater still uses it, and there has to be a balance, right? So it's a flexible thing where resources are held centrally initially, they are delegated, taken back, delegated, taken back as the battle progresses. So similar approach has to be taken with the resources which we have. It is it goes without saying that all long range systems, whether they are like rockets and missiles or guns or aircraft, or they have to be used centrally. You have to be centrally controlled, and delegation has to be done as the battle progresses. But that doesn't mean that the theater commanders are not given the assurance. Okay, they're in his location. He's got this air force or the air assets, which he knows will come to him. Look, we are all at that level. People are very mature. They're handling big things. They have to have that ability to cooperate and do things. And this is what I've learned as a gunner. You do centralized control and you decentralize execution as the battle progresses, or you regain control, and it's an up and down process. So I don't see anything different happening, right?
Uh,
So yeah, your views, Satish.
no, I endorse whatever you said. Let me just try and give it a different perspective to the issue. Achin, you would want to know what issues with the Air Force or concerns of the Air Force. Let me put it this way. Over a period of time, the air defense, let's talk only about air defense itself, has become very complex. You have different kind of platforms, all different types of air defense aircrafts. You have artillery weapons, you have missiles. Today, UAVs are adding on to it, drones. So, all I'm trying to say is that air defense and with their radar coverage is becoming very, very complex. For instance, if Pinakas or some long range vectors are firing and the aircrafts have to go through for our own missions. You would have to stop artillery firing.
Correct.
Kind of missiles that are being employed, you would have to stop their firing for our own fighters to get through. So air defense itself is becoming very complicated, or complex, shall I say. And that is why, if you see you hear in the news, one of the first structure that is being really sort of being planned at a faster speed than others is the Air Defense Command. Air defense is to be integrated rightly under the Indian Air Force. It has, in fact, if I have my facts right, in 1993, Army gave the responsibility of, we sort of handed over everything to air defense in terms of the control. So the fact of the matter is that Air Force has to take charge of this entire thing. Now, the other aspect, and so in so doing, all the resources that are under command, Army as well as Navy, will also then come under them, except that are required for the tactical defense. For example, a strike corps will have its own limited air defense for the strike corps, but overall umbrella will be under the Air Force. Then, as far as air assets is concerned, that is talking plainly of fighter aircrafts is concerned, General Shankar has explained it well. I won't repeat those things, because true, our number of our squadrons are down, but that is down even now. Today, Air Force is operating in, let's say, 5 commands, operational commands. And so tomorrow there might be whatever number of theaters, 3 or 4 are integrated commands are formed. Then they would be operating allocated in those. The only difference being that instead of then being centralized at the air headquarters in Delhi, like we discussed earlier, all assets will be sort of reporting or allocated to the integrated commands, whichever are the integrated commands that are formed. Also, let us also remember that since the assets are less, so there will obviously be a requirement of rebalancing depending on the situation.
Yeah.
Rebalancing has to be done depending on a situation. Now we have a situation in Ladakh. Then maybe if we have to rebalance some from the western to the eastern side, that would be done by the advice of this CDS and the 3 service chiefs. Obviously, whose advice is going to take? Air Force mainly, isn't it? So the air chief, that is. So the point I'm trying to make, forces on allocation will be there ab initio. Forces on allotment will be allotted later, and that will flow as per the situation. So, and out of the 3 services, it is Air Force that is capable of maximum mobility. They can deploy and redeploy much faster than the Navy or the land elements. So I leave this issue there, and so this is where I think we go ahead with Air Force taking charge of certain functions and being part in the other. But last sentence I'd like to say, if there are concerns that one is not aware of, we all must sit down together and address the concerns, as I'm sure that it must be me.
Yeah. Not only that, I'd like to add things like refuelers, AWACS, AW, then surveillance, right? These assets are few. Okay, they will be remain controlled, centralized. They should remain centralized for control and deployment, because they will be deployed on as required basis. Then, of course, a very important point which General Dua brought out is that air power is just not about fighter aircraft only. It is about infrastructure also, which is resident in all the theaters. It is also, when you talk of offensive air power, you're talking of long range missiles, you're talking of unmanned systems which are coming up in a big way. And what the Air Force has, there are 3. And of course, don't forget that the Navy also has a big hand in the air power. And we're not only talking of the land borders, we're talking of the marine borders also, right? Or seas. So the 4 components have to work together. And like I said earlier, maybe initially you will keep it centralized, but later you have to decentralize. And at some point of time, like what he said, you will have to rebalance and reshift forces and concentrate. And that's the greatest asset of the Air Force, to concentrate at a point of time of decision. And who better than the Air Force to do it? Right? So, something has to flow from the center. And that element is what I think has the crux. What is that element which will be kept centralized always? Who will handle it? We also have to look at the out of area contingencies and your paratroopers and all those, which are, for example, the Maldives operation, which people took.
Yeah.
It was conducted from ex Agra long back. So for these things, we need to have some system. I mean, these are the things which I suppose the vice chiefs and all will sit down and talk. And again, there are no easy answers for this.
Mm.
If you have an easy answer, and if it is settled, I'll be suspicious of it. I would like it to be tough and thought through and hammered through.
Absolutely.
I mean, professionally, not pig-headedly. Yeah.
I think some of the points that the generals have brought out are very interesting. And the first thing that I'd like to say, what General Shankar had pointed out, was that I'd rather err in being slow. And that is something which is very important for all of us to understand, because this is a large sector that we're talking about with large forces. Although we're one of the largest armed forces in the world, so it's not going to be an easy task. General Satish had also brought out what has been done for a long time and what has been carried out in terms of the processes and stuff like that, and some very wise thoughts in terms of how this process should be taken forward. As far as the Air Force is concerned, obviously the concerns are understood with regards the numbers, with regards their capabilities at the moment. And I'm sure I agree with both the generals when they say just because the numbers are low right now doesn't mean that the progress or a change in the entire way that we do things should be stopped. Uh, it is for the better future that this is being done. And I'm sure the people on the ground, and as this was brought out very, very clearly during the Chinese standoff as well, trust the men on the ground. There are people who are more aware, much clearly aware of the situation that they are facing in the country today. And I think it's time that we trust the people who are wearing the uniform and taking command of these roles. Thank you, sir, both of you, for bringing this factor out very, very clearly, because obviously there is a bit of a nervousness within people that understand this entire thing, looking at the threats that we are facing from both the sides. People feel that if we have been able, we should not be doing something like that at this particular moment. But I take your view in saying that threats will always be there, but we need to change. We need to change for the betterment, for a more efficient and a more stronger armed forces. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jai Hind.
Jai Hind, sir.